Good evening. I'm Cameo George, Executive Producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we are pleased to present an extended preview of our film, Nazi-Town, USA, which premieres next Tuesday, January 23rd at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on PBS. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsor, Liberty Mutual Insurance. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, members of the Better Angels Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. In February 1939, more than 20,000 Americans filled Madison Square Garden for an event billed as a pro-American rally. Images of George Washington hung next to swastikas, and speakers called for a return to a racially pure America. The keynote speaker that night was Fritz Kuhn, head of an organization called the German American Bund. Nazi-Town, USA tells the largely unknown story of the Bund, which had scores of chapters in suburbs and big cities across this country and represented what many believe was a real threat of fascism in the United States. The Bund held joint rallies with the Ku Klux Klan and ran dozens of summer camps for children centered around Nazi ideology and imagery. Its melding of patriotic values with virulent anti-Semitism raised thorny free speech issues that we continue to wrestle with today. It is my privilege to introduce our panelists for this conversation. Peter Yost is the writer, producer, and director of Nazi-Town, USA. He is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker and the founder of Brooklyn-based Pangloss Films. Peter has also directed films in conjunction with PBS, Nova, National Geographic, and the New York Times. Edna Alburquerque is the producer of Nazi-Town, USA. She has worked on award-winning documentary films for over 15 years, including over a decade with Pangloss Films. She has also worked on projects for Nova and National Geographic. Beverly Gage is the John Lewis Gaddis Professor of History at Yale University. She has received numerous awards and prizes for her scholarly work. Her most recent book, G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography in 2023. Thank you guys for joining us. So much to talk about. There are already so many questions in the chat, so it's hard to know where to begin. But I'm going to start with Peter and Edna. One of the things that people are saying in the chat and that people always talk about when I describe the film is how surprised they are by the extent of pro-Nazi sympathies in America in the lead up to World War II. It feels like this is this lost moment in history that people are now recently starting to talk about more, but didn't know a lot about. Can we just talk about the atmosphere at the time that enabled groups like the German American Bund to take hold and capture people's imaginations?
Sure. I think it was a fascinating time in America, this time being the 1920s and 30s, as we touch on in the first part of the film. And it was fascinating for a number of reasons. Foremost among them, the Great Depression that created massive anxiety, upset, and as we mentioned in the film, fear throughout. So it was a very unstable time. And I think Americans were really at a crossroads. There were a number of people that were questioning whether democracy itself had run its course, whether it could get us out of this economic problem. And people were turning to radical alternatives, or radical to us at the moment, they would seem to be, whether on the left, communism, or on the far right, fascism, or other right-wing alternatives. So it was a very tumultuous time. And we are telling the story of the Bund, obviously, which is a particular and somewhat narrow organization. But what was fascinating, at least to me, as we dug into this project, was to learn that the Bund itself was one of scores, if not hundreds, of right-wing organizations in America at the time that were, if not fascist, were in many ways fascist-friendly, one could say. And so the Bund is our story, but in a way, the bigger story that we're trying to explore is what was going on in America in the 20s, but really the 30s, that made it fertile ground for the Bund and for countless other groups like this. And one of the things that, again, we can talk about a bit later that was surprising to me is there's a tendency, I think, for many viewers, or certainly even for myself coming into the project, to think, oh, Nazism or fascism, this is something that's quote unquote over there or far removed from America. But when one looks at the 20s and 30s, one sees that there are a number of reasons why the Bund believed, and in reality did, get traction in this country. There were a number of ideas that resonated then, both with members of the Bund and many other right-wing groups.
Mm-hmm. And Beverly, can you expand on that a little bit? The idea that, again, that this was fertile ground in this time period in America. Like, what were some of the factors that were making these ideologies so attractive?
I think it's certainly true that a lot of Americans today don't know this history, particularly the history of the mid-30s, and the rise of this proliferation of fascist movements, some of which, like the German-American Bund, were German in their orientation, and then others that were more generically fascist, right, that embraced ideas of racial hierarchy or the concentration of power in a kind of charismatic dictatorship. These ideas were reasonably widespread in the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s. Right? So once the US entered the war in the 40s, there became a powerful incentive to kind of write this out of our history. And in some ways, that's the better angels of our nature, right? That kind of anti-fascist sentiment. But that doesn't, I think, allow us to ignore this earlier history. And the German-American Bund is one factor in all of this, but there are lots of other organizations, right? One of the dominant political forces, as the film suggests, of the 1920s was the Ku Klux Klan, which was a very widespread, very important political organization in the 1920s. It was an organization that was not only based in a kind of racist worldview and an embrace of racial hierarchy, but embraced anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant sentiments, right? And so you can see the ways in which these strains of American politics are already there in the 20s. And then the crisis of the Depression comes along, and the 30s, it just seems like, you know, the social order might be about to collapse. And so you got to find something new, and fascism was one of those options.
Mm-hmm. And Edna, during the process of making the film, one of the things that that we talked about, Peter, you, me, our team, was that we are looking at this period when fascism takes hold, when Nazism, people are flirting with it here in America. But you went to great pains through the interview with Beverly. Sarah Churchwell talks about it as well, to make clear that Nazism then wasn't quite yet what it is that we know it to be today. Can you talk about that a little bit, just for clarification?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a really important point, and one that we sort of, the more we got into this subject, became more and more cognizant of. I think it's easy to kind of be guilty of presentism, to see things from our current perspective. Today, when we hear the word Nazi, we have certain connotations. We have, as it was, read the book to the end. And the people who were watching what was going on in Germany didn't have that, the benefit of that sort of hindsight that we did. And so I think that is something we tried to always keep in mind. We tried to portray in the film. And, it's interesting to think about, how brave and in a way almost visionary those individuals who resisted so vehemently were at that time. For someone like Dorothy Thompson, or for someone, like the sort of, Jews who spoke up early on, as early as 1933 and 34, that's quite amazing that they were able to see that so clearly and speak up so forcibly against it. And so, yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that we hadn't thought about before we really dug into this time period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And since you're talking about things that this process of discovery on your parts, Peter and Edna, maybe starting with Peter, like what surprised you in the making of the film? Or is there a piece of archival in particular that, you were just so excited to uncover that just really crystallized this idea for you?
There are a number of things. Archivally, I think it was quite rich, as one can see perhaps in the section that we saw. The 1939 Madison Square Garden rally, which 20,000 plus Bund members attended, is visually striking. We see it here at the beginning of the film, and then in a much longer piece still to come in the full film. And that is jaw-dropping for many kind of obvious reasons. But beyond that, I think a couple of things that struck me personally archivally, the degree to which the Bund filmed what they were up to, not that they should perhaps, been ashamed of it per se. I mean, again, that could be presentism. They were proud of what they were doing. A number of them believed in, as Hitler and a number of Nazis believed, the potential of the 1,000-year Reich, that they were recording things for posterity, that the summer camps were there to train future generations, and they recorded it. A number of the film clips that were made of the summer camps, which we see at the beginning and again twice, I think, in the section that we've seen, a number of those were filmed as recruitment videos in some instances for potential parents to send their children, much like today for a YMCA camp, one might check out a camp video before sending one's child. And so it was interesting to see that. And the final piece, I guess, on the archival front was just the ubiquity of these images and the how widespread the Bund was. I don't want to overemphasize the numbers, and numbers are hard to come by. It was probably in the thousands, maybe the tens of thousands, certainly no more than that. But one could argue that they punched beyond their weight. They were media savvy. They were quite in your face. They wanted attention, and their ideas were picked up by others around them, and they were and so it was interesting, and Edna could perhaps speak to this because she did a lot of the real digging. But when we would just go city to city, almost even town to town across America, calling small libraries, looking for things, it would turn out, oh, we do have this. I mean, even I'm sitting here in Brooklyn, and I was personally surprised to see a lovely photograph from the 30s in Prospect Park, Brooklyn, of the Nazi soccer team holding a banner in Prospect Park and proudly playing soccer, alongside everybody else. So really in many, I can't say all, but in many communities across America and in small libraries and elsewhere, there are records of this, and that was fascinating and surprising.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's so interesting as you're talking about, as you're talking about these different images that you come across, that groups like the Bunds truly were woven into everyday life of these different communities. It's also really striking to me that when you do see the photographs, the video, the film, the way that they use American Americana, like American imagery, I think is really striking. You referred to the Madison Square Garden rally where there are giant, posters of George Washington and founding fathers. In the clip that we saw the fake Native American chief. Like, there was just something about Americanism that they were really trying to latch onto. Can one of you talk a little bit about why that was so important and why that was so integral to the message?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I think that the Bund was sort of saying about themselves and deeply believed is that a lot of these ideas that they had, these anti-Semitic ideas, these racist ideas, these sort of, fascist ideas, were very compatible with some things that were sort of in the air and the water in American life as it was. They, even in the speech that we heard in the film, they latched onto specific laws and practices and sort of currents in American life. And I think they really did believe that these things were compatible. The vision of America that they had, which wasn't necessarily what others saw in America, but what they chose to see were the things that that they saw similarities with. There were immigration restrictions, there were eugenics laws on the books, there were Jim Crow laws, and so all of these things to them seemed sort of like a natural fit. And so in their mind, these things were compatible. And so it was both a sort of savvy PR move to meld these images together and to sort of say, we are you, you are us. But also, I think they really did believe that that's sort of what the founding fathers had intended.
If I can follow up on that real quickly, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about looking at this history of the Bund or of fascist movements in the United States more generally is the fact that it highlights the United States as this place of profoundly competing political traditions, right? There might be an impulse to say, aha, we see here's fascism in the United States. We've gotten to the bitter core of what America really is. And I don't think that that's true. I think those ideas about racial hierarchy, about dictatorship, anti-democratic ideas, all of these pieces of the kind of fascist mindset are parts of the American tradition. And then there are also, profoundly powerful movements that push back against this. And you see that in the film as well. Figures like Dorothy Thompson, but I think, more broadly, one of the kind of rallying cries of the American left in the 1930s was an anti-fascist cry. And that wasn't just abroad, but was also at home. Ultimately, a lot of those folks become labeled, one of my favorite phrases in all of American political history, prematurely anti-fascist. So if you end up being prematurely anti-fascist, it means you were maybe a little too far left in the 1930s and you were opposed to fascism before everyone else was opposed to fascism. But I think even that phrase speaks to the idea that there's this deep contest going on in this moment. And the Bund and the figures we see are on one side, but it's only part of this broader story.
Mm-hmm. One of our audience members is asking, so we're talking about, again, the very public facing activities of the Bunds, of these other groups, the fact that people were not ashamed of being members of these groups, they're not ashamed of the ideology, and that, as Beverly, you're saying that the different ideas, they have traction for sometimes legitimate reasons. But someone is asking, did the Bunds participate in illegal activities? Was there a more underground version of this public-facing Bunds, which was involved in procuring weapons, planning violent acts, etc.? Peter, I don't know if you can answer that.
Well, I think the Bund itself, I don't know that there are extensive records showing extensive planning or extensive legal things going on. They cut a lot of corners, as evidence. We might talk about this a bit later with their leader, Fritz Kuhn, who we meet in the clip that we saw, was quite a character. And among other things, he ultimately was brought down, not to give it away, but he was brought down in an Al Capone way, on his own version of tax evasion, but he had laundered money and used it to pay actually the psychiatrist for his girlfriend and other things with his mistresses. So he was embezzled, and he was jailed on charges of embezzlement. And he was doing other things as well. And they had problems sometimes with property, money laundering, these sorts of things. In terms of, there were other Nazi-affiliated groups that were, quote unquote, doing things, stockpiling munitions, or there's stories that have been told that especially came out during the war. But I don't know, and Edna or Beverly, maybe you guys know, but as far as I know, there was nothing directly like that traced to the Bund in the record. But again, to say that somebody was strictly a member of the Bund and wasn't a member of something else, or there wasn't overlap, it wasn't necessarily formalized. And just a final thought on that too, in the midst of the Great Depression, and this gets to the number of people that did or did not belong to the Bund, I was struck when somebody pointed out to us that joining a group in the Great Depression that involved a monthly membership fee, was a big ask. It was a higher bar. And so there were probably a lot of people who supported Bund ideas or might have been affiliated, but weren't formal members. And so I think, I don't know of anything like that explicitly tied to the Bund, but maybe the others do, I don't know.
That's my sense as well, although I would say a couple of things. One, that the Bund, as if you watch the full film, you will see, does end up in violent physical confrontations sometimes with counter-protesters and in that sort of direct action mode. And then there were any number of other groups, the Black Legion, the Christian Front. Ultimately, there are certain fascist groups that are put on trial in the 40s for more explicit forms of conspiracy against the government, stockpiling of weapons, and that really have organized themselves much more in a paramilitary fashion. Now, sometimes those claims were exaggerated both by the government and by the people who were involved in the organizations, who both tended to have a kind of incentive to make that sort of exaggeration. But the Bund tended to be more on the agitation, propaganda, speech, social end of the spectrum than on the paramilitary end.
I'll just add to that to say that, there were several members of the Bund who were eventually convicted, whether of espionage or various plots to sort of sabotage U.S. efforts in the war. It's not clear that those were sort of officially sanctioned Bund efforts, but as Peter was alluding to, a lot of people who had those kinds of sympathies ended up kind of being members of several different groups, more extreme, more violent, less violent, etc. And so, yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and I'm sure there were members who were kind of up to no good, but it's not clear that that was a kind of official stated policy over the whole group.
And maybe just to add one last thing to that, Edna, there was something called Der Tag, German for the day, that was whispered about and sometimes spoken about openly by Bund members. And that the day was the day when the Bund or fascist-friendly organizations would rise up and take over America. How serious and solid and widespread that was, I don't know. I'm not sure anybody actually does, but there were whispers about that. And we do mention that in the film.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, guns and plans and things like that were seized in some chapters. So yeah, I mean, it's totally possible that there were individual cells within the Bund who were planning things, but.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So another question from the audience, and I think this dovetails with what we're talking about. There might have been lone wolves, rogue actors who had slightly different plans, splinter groups as well, some that were more aligned with the cultural organization of the Bund, some that were more aligned with Der Tag and the takeover. Someone in our audience is asking, did Fritz Kuhn actually envision achieving political power in the US through the political process? Or was his sole goal to mount an armed Nazi coup?
I don't want to put myself in Fritz Kuhn's mind for many reasons,
Not a good
but
place to be.
exactly. But my understanding, and Edna, Beverly, I'm curious for your thoughts again, but I don't think he ever worked the political system in any serious fashion. He wasn't out there creating a party. That is something, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit down the line, and something that Beverly knows a lot about, I know, but Lindbergh, the America First movement, which was coalescing into an actual political entity, and had significant 800,000, a million followers around the time America entered World War II. And that was a significant force, and potentially a dominant one, or certainly an ascendant one. I think Kuhn, as far again as I can tell, or we can tell, I think, was wanting power within the German community, within this world that he was operating within. And I think there's a story where he went to Berlin, and this is true, it's documented, and met Hitler himself right around the Olympics in Berlin. And he was glad handing him, he wanted any of this glamour and prestige and legitimacy to rub off on him so that he could take it home and kind of lord it over folks here and prop himself up. So I think if Germany had won the war, there was probably, again, I'm guessing here, but one could imagine that had the Nazis won World War II, he was playing a game where he could have been Hitler's man in America. There's no evidence to suggest that. I think Hitler, and we could get into this as well, put his nose up, not only turned up his nose at Kuhn, but thought that that the Bund and organizations like this were actually hurting the Nazi cause because they were agitating America and drawing attention to Nazi Germany at a time when Hitler didn't want America to become involved more than they already were becoming.
Since you brought up America First, and sort of served that up for Beverly, can you talk a little bit more about America First? Was that group actually more dangerous than the Bund? In the film, that comes later than the clip that we showed. But can you talk about that? Because there are a couple of questions from our audience about Charles Lindbergh, about America First, also Father Coughlin, who's not quite connected, but just this idea that there were other groups out there that were actually perhaps more insidious than the Bund at this time, that were sort of tangentially connected to the Bund.
In some ways, I do think America First is a more important organization or set of alliances than the Bund itself. So it's not nearly as shocking, right? What's sort of stunning about the footage that's in the film, about the story of the Bund, is its very explicit nature, right? These are people speaking German, heiling Hitler, right, carrying around swastikas and kind of championing that as an essential part, not only of their German identity, but of their American identity as well. But America First is a much broader tent, and in many ways a much more interesting and influential movement than the Bund, in part because it's not explicitly tied to Germany, but is really a big alliance of people on the left, in the middle, on the right, who do not want the United States involved in the Second World War. In our national myth now about the Second World War, right, the United States is kind of the crusading anti-fascist force. But of course, the Second World War went on for about 2.5 years before the United States explicitly entered the war. It's Pearl Harbor that pushes the United States into the war. And of course, it's Germany that declares war on the United States and not the other way around in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. And so there's this period from 1939 into 1941 when there's a very powerful sentiment in the United States against getting involved in the war. And that includes people who are explicitly pro-Nazi. It includes people like Charles Lindbergh, who are anti-Semitic, but who are also making an argument, that the German military machine is simply too powerful for the United States to fight against. There are pacifists from the left involved in America First. There are lots and lots of young people of all stripes who looked at what happened during the First World War, in which their generation was slaughtered, and said, we don't want any part of this. And that was a powerful, politically significant force that drew lots of people together, and I think was in some ways much more deeply rooted in an American language and an American tradition than the much more explicitly pro-Nazi Bund.
Peter or Edna, anything to add to that?
That was beautifully said. No, I mean, I think, a lot of people have said that sort of Charles Lindbergh was a more palatable figure to Americans. And that's maybe what, made him more dangerous. But Beverly said it much better than I could.
And more palatable than Fritz Kuhn, you mean?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, he was, of course, as many know, but an American hero who had flown solo across the Atlantic. He was, I'll put quotes around it, I'm not weighing in one way or the other, but considered good looking. He didn't have, Kuhn had a very strong accent. I won't weigh in on Kuhn's looks, but most would probably have picked Lindbergh on appearances. He was charismatic. He was kind of an all-American boy, I think, in a traditional, conventional sense, and a package. And I think, we found some images which are near the end of the film when we cover this section of Lindbergh, and he's essentially doing the Nazi salute, the Sieg Heil. There was some debate even among historians about whether it was that or a different type of salute known as the Bellamy salute, et cetera, et cetera. And one could even argue that, to my mind, it's a rather academic debate, because to be doing that when he was in the 1940s, he had to know that was, if it wasn't an overt Nazi salute at that time, it was certainly a dog whistle. And so I think America First, while there were real beliefs and even defensible beliefs about staying out of the war there, it was a broad tent that could envelop some really noxious views as well, some of those that were embodied by the Bund and some of these other right-wing organizations, but in a kind of more palatable package with Lindbergh.
One of our audience members is asking, and this is specifically for Beverly, did Hoover ever actively go after these groups like America First, like the Bund, and if not, why? I think we started to get to that at the end of our clip, but if you could talk about that a little bit as our Hoover expert.
Sure, and the answer is yes and no. Throughout the 1930s, there are this interesting series of conversations that go on between Franklin Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover, who is a relatively young man at that point, but is really kind of coming into prominence as the head of the FBI, and in 1934, but especially in 1936, and then into 1938 and continuing onward. Roosevelt brings him into the White House and says, look, Edgar, we've got these dangerous forces in the land, and I need you to go out there and tell me what the heck is going on, and kind of provide political intelligence about all of this. The president asks him to do it, and so Hoover goes out and does it. One of the organizations he looks at is the Bund, but he's looking really both at organizations on the kind of pro-fascist, pro-Nazi right, as well as communist organizations and organizations on the far left. Roosevelt wants to know about both of them. So there's a whole lot of intelligence gathering. There are informants. There are reports made. What there aren't a lot of at the federal level are prosecutions, particularly in the 1930s, in part because you didn't have very effective federal laws through which to do that. Once the war itself gets going, you actually see a real ramping up of the prosecutorial power, as well as, kind of serious investment in kind of criminal investigations and also wartime internment investigations. We tend to think about the Second World War and think about Japanese internment, and for good reason. But there was an internment program run by the Department of Justice that was also aimed at fascist sympathizers, particularly German German citizens, Italian citizens who were considered disloyal and suspect. So you do have a number of people interned during the war. There are a number of espionage and sabotage investigations. One of my favorites is the investigation of the German saboteurs who were sent over in U-boats in 1942 and dropped off on Long Island and in Florida to kind of blow things up. In the United States, they get caught by the FBI. They're mostly executed, but one of the things that's interesting about those saboteurs, who were in fact, sent from German intelligence all the way across the Atlantic, is that many of them were people who had been naturalized in the United States, had had experience of living in the United States before this period, and many of them had in fact been members of the Bund during that period.
I'll add an interesting anecdote that we found during our sort of archival footage explorations, which is that after the war, or after the US was already at war, there were a couple of newsreels that Hoover did produce that sort of had a message of, we've been tracking these guys all along. Don't worry, we've been on it. And in those newsreels, they do a bunch of sort of dramatic recreations of all the activities, groups that look sort of eerily like the Bund, and even they do a recreation of the rally at Madison Square Garden and the flyers, and they say American people weren't aware of this threat, but we were tracking it the whole time. So I think he's also sort of practicing the hindsight being 2020.
Although there was a little bit of truth to that, because he and Franklin Roosevelt agreed they were going to do this, but they weren't going to tell anyone about it because people might get all, worried about their civil liberties if they knew what was really going on.
Thank you. Thank you both. We've talked about this idea that there was some knowledge of what was happening behind the scenes. Beverly, you just spoke very eloquently about what was happening with Hoover and the FBI and FDR, those conversations. So on one hand, a lot of the American public was somewhat in the dark about what was happening with all of these groups. And yet, one of the things that I think is covered really nicely in this film are the voices of opposition. And you talked, I think, both Edna and Peter, you referred to this a little bit before, the Dorothy Thompsons, the John Metcalfs. Can you talk just a little bit more about those people who were shouting, like, look at what's happening. This is, we're ignoring it, and we ignore it at our own peril, because there are some really dangerous ideas that are taking hold over here. Can you talk about both Dorothy Thompson, why it was important to include her story, which is not well known, and then also the amazing story of John Metcalf and how he infiltrated the Bunds. I think people in our audience are wondering what was being done. So Beverly covered more at the governmental level, but can you talk about more of the individuals who were fighting back or attempting to fight back?
Sure, sure. Edna, do you want to talk about Dorothy Thompson, or shall I? We both love her, so
Yeah.
either. But I think, well, Dorothy Thompson, who we meet for the first time in the clip that we have seen, she does come back later in the film in a powerful way. I think is an inspiring figure, and as you mentioned, Cameo, one who I think most people have never heard of, or certainly don't know much about. But she was a woman who was a correspondent, a foreign correspondent in Europe before the war, and very early on, before he took power even, was writing very aggressively against Hitler and even mocking him in print, calling him out for what she saw him to be, which was a racist and a danger. And one of the first things that Hitler did upon ascending to power in 1933 was summarily dismiss or kick Dorothy Thompson out of Germany and ship her off, which she wore as a badge of honor throughout her life, as mentioned in the clip, I think. And when she came back to America, she remained outspoken, giving hundreds, if not thousands, of speeches, writing columns. And again, not to give it away, but she pops up again at Madison Square Garden at this infamous rally in 1939, surrounded by 20,000 Bundists, and went there to this rally with the explicit intention of creating havoc or calling out what she saw to be dangerous, quote unquote, bunk, in her words. She yelled over and over, and she was thrown out not once, but twice from the rally, which took, both physical bravery and strength, obviously, in other ways. So she's one example of somebody. She wrote a great piece in The Atlantic long ago called "Who Goes Nazi?", which is really remarkable. I'd recommend it. We should, if we haven't, perhaps we could link to it on the site, on the American Experience site. But it is a amusing but incisive exploration in the minds of people at a fictional cocktail party. And basically, she's surrounded by people socializing, and she's wondering, underneath the pretty veneer and the social niceties, who in here actually would go Nazi if push came to shove? And she describes character after character. It's really an amazing piece of writing and really of psychology, and kind of hauntingly relevant depending on your perspective today as one contemplates outcomes in the future in America. So it's a really powerful, powerful piece of writing, but she was not afraid to get her hands dirty and speak out. And she's one of a number of people. And that's something, without talking our whole way through the film here, but we went out of our way to try to include that piece because it's essential. We touched at the end of the clip, I think, on the free speech issues that the Bund raised. And that's an example of a question, an issue that was of vital importance back then and great intensity. And lo and behold, here we are nearly a century later, and it's literally in the headlines daily today. So what's fascinating to me is to tell this story, to go back, do a deep dive in this period of time and see that in some ways they were wrestling with very similar questions that are still with us. And that's powerful. And that's the free speech question, but we wanted to not just leave it as an intellectual question. Free speech, it's important, because to my mind anyway, and this is just me speaking as me, the backside of free speech, or the other side of it, is it's not enough to sit on one's couch and simply be like, free speech is okay, this will take care of itself, we'll let ideas collide. That's fine, as long as there are other people getting off their couches, like Dorothy Thompson, as it were, and speaking and pushing back. And I think that was really important, to kind of do a deep dive and show other Thompson and others who provided the counterweight to some of these ideas.
If I could add to that, I think there are really a couple of other important groups to think about in what you might call the pushback against these ideas and against the organizations themselves. So, of course, there are a lot of Jewish organizations that are organizing very actively, very early on in the 30s, sometimes, as you'll see in the film, in direct confrontation, sometimes even in sort of street fights with members of the Bund and similar groups. The Communist Party turns out to be very important. So the Communist Party never has deep legitimacy in the United States. It's about the same size as the Bund, I think, in terms of sheer membership numbers in the 1930s, but really considers itself to be at the vanguard of this fight against fascism, both abroad and at home. And at home, they define it not only as fighting against groups like the Bund, but engaging in civil rights activism and other forms of kind of racial egalitarianism that are pretty unusual for that moment. And they are a very powerful force. And then, since we're talking about Dorothy Thompson, correct me if I am wrong, Peter and Edna, but her husband was Sinclair Lewis, yes?
Yep.
Who wrote sort of the classic anti-fascist novel of the 1930s, inspired by a lot of her reporting, It Can't Happen Here. And that has been a book that really has been a touchstone for many generations of Americans who have thought about an anti-fascist struggle, but have thought about, what fascism might look like if it came to the United States. And that was really his literary imagining. It's a slightly hackneyed novel, but worth revisiting, of what an American form and brand of fascism might look like. And, it's worth saying that in the last 5-10 years, it's become a big bestseller again in the United States. It's something that people are looking to from the 1930s that Dorothy Thompson inspired, but I think is better known than a lot of her own writing.
Mm-hmm. In the Q&A, a lot of people are asking about the ties to today, and Beverly, I think that you just guided us in that direction. Peter and Edna, throughout the making of the film, there have been inevitably echoes of today, and people are asking if we made the film because of what's happening today. Obviously, I have an answer, and I am always very careful to tell people that the film has been a year in the making, and so a lot of the conversations that are happening today were not necessarily in our minds when we decided to move forward on this project. But as Beverly just noted, it's not just within the last year that some of these ideas about a strong man, about ideas of fascism have taken hold. So, Peter, how do you answer the question of when people ask if the film was made to be timely? What do you say? Or made to be a response to what's happening? Right. You want it to be timely, of course, but if it was made in direct response to something that's happening today.
Right. Yeah, I certainly hope it is timely, but I don't feel like it was intended as a direct response to where we are. I think that said, what is fascinating to me has been to dig into the 20s and 30s and see that many of these currents that we're discussing that one might see today and wonder, where do this othering of people, these some of the same questions or the same dynamics that we're seeing play out in today's politics, in today's kind of world, were in many ways present back in the 20s and 30s, that there were deep roots for some of these ideas in America. And we've spoken about how we went to war, as Beverly explained, of course, how we were after Pearl Harbor, and then Germany declared war on us, and we went and we fought the quote unquote good war, and good that we did. I am not minimizing that in the least or undercutting that. But what and we push back against fascism, and we quote unquote save the world for democracy. And that is the story that I think many, if not all of us, grew up with, and there is a great deal of truth to that. But that also allowed us to leave unexamined the reality, the more complicated truth that many of these ugly currents pre-existed World War II, and we never really necessarily confronted that. And so they were perhaps lying latent throughout the post-war years and over the decades, and these things never really went away. They are a deep part of American history. That's not the only part of American history, as we were mentioning, as Beverly was mentioning earlier, and I don't want to seem too negative about all of this, but at the same time, we can't blindly whitewash them away. And I think there's a great power to looking in a deep and hopefully substantive way at the situation on the ground in America in the 20s and 30s, realizing that America has been in difficult spots before, even where they were questioning the future of democracy. And there's perhaps some resonance and some comfort even in knowing that America made it through that, and looking at how people responded to those questions back then. There are of course a lot of differences, but I'm sure that there will be some resonances for people as well. But no, it wasn't an intentional response to the moment of the time, but I think there are some echoes.
Edna, do you want to add to that? I think that's going to be our last question. What do you hope that people take away from this film when they watch it in its entirety?
The phrase that has sort of been floating around my mind constantly since we've been working on this project and since we've been kind of dealing with these materials is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so I think that looking at history is often a very useful lens through which to see our own times, because it offers some remove from the sort of current issues. And so I hope that, I'll echo what Peter said. I hope that people take away from this film that, we've been in difficult moments before and have persevered. And that, democracy is a garden that needs to be tended. The warnings of Dorothy Thompson and of all those figures sound like they could, be printed in the newspapers of today or on the radio today. I think, it is quite inspiring to see sort of how this turned out, and also maybe a bit of a warning.
Thank you for that. And thank you to all of you for joining us tonight for this special sneak peek at Nazitown, USA. We hope that you watch the full film when it premieres next Tuesday, January 23rd at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on PBS or on the PBS video app. Again, thank you to our guests, Peter Yost, Edna Alburquerque, and Beverly Gage. Good night.